Hello and welcome to another Smaulgld live stream. Today is Saturday, August 18th, 2018. And the topic of tonight's episode is President issues executive order to jail journalists. We're going to get into that topic and some breaking news on what's going on with the First Amendment. But first, let's take a look at the week in review for the gold and silver markets. Gold closed the week at 1184, under the 1200 mark, although it did rebound on Friday. Silver closed at 1477, also under the $15 mark. The cryptocurrencies, they go up and they go down. They had a rebound yesterday, and since then they've fallen off a bit, have risen a bit. So Bitcoin at about 6,400. Bitcoin Cash at 556. Ethereum fell below 300 again. It had been at about 315. It's at 296. Litecoin at 57.39. It had reached as high as 62 a while back. All right, tonight we're going to take a break from our typical gold and silver talk and talk about the First Amendment and things that have been going on in the United States. First of all, there's a lot of confusion, and that's what we're leading to headlines like I just read about what the First Amendment is. And it gets really complicated when people don't know anything, and then they start talking about private companies, and they start talking about what the president said, and then we have these 300 newspapers taking out editorials saying the president is trying to stop free speech, and then we have Brennan saying his free speech is being stopped. You got Alex Jones saying, hey, everybody's talking about how their free speech is being infringed. And let's take a look at the First Amendment. And it's very simple. It basically says, well, not basically, it says verbatim, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of the people peacefully to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So within the First Amendment talks about basically freedom of religion, and that the government can't establish religion, and you can't be told you can't practice your religion. We're not concerned about that at the moment. It's the second part of the First Amendment we're concerned about, is the abridging of the freedom of speech or of the press. And then the part we're not concerned about right now is or the right of the people to peacefully assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So we're focusing on the abridging of freedom of speech or of the press. And what the First Amendment says is that Congress cannot make a law abridging the freedom of speech or the freedom of the press. If you take that middle part of the First Amendment, don't worry about the religion part and don't worry about the assembly part, just focus on the language. It says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. So that means that everyone has the freedom of speech, and that Congress can't say that Joe Smith can't speak, and it also says that Congress can't say a particular press entity does not have the right to exist. Historically, this was challenged, or I wouldn't even say challenged, but was ignored in 1798. Under President John Adams, who was a Federalist, his Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. I don't know if you guys know about the Alien and Sedition Acts, but the Federalist Congress in 1798 passed 4 Alien and Sedition Acts, and President Adams, founding father, signed it. A quick word about the Federalists. The Federalists were the people who believed, like Alexander Hamilton, in national banks, in a top-down, more of the English system, an authoritative, not based on states' rights, but more based on the federal government ruling over the provinces, as it were. And there was a strong Federalist movement as part, and that's part of their DNA because they grew up with that. It was very hard for many of the founding fathers to really grasp onto the idea that they really did finally approve in the Constitution, which was devolving of the power from the federal level down to the states. The natural course of government is always to roll up government into one more authoritative entity than to devolve the power down to the states. And that's why you have, over time, you've seen the federal government getting more and more power. But you might be surprised that within just 10 years, 11 years of the signing of the Constitution, that they had passed a law that had 4 parts. There was a Naturalization Act, which we're not going to be concerned about here. They're always passing naturalization acts, but this was political in nature. They were trying to prevent immigrants from voting, so they extended the period of time from which immigrants would need to be in the country in order to vote. But that's been superseded many times with different naturalization acts. But then there was another act as part of this whole legislative body of work, was the Alien Friends Act of 1798. Now this one allowed the president to toss people in prison and to deport non-citizens if he thought they were dangerous. Another part of this legislative action was the Alien Enemy Act of 1798. And that was, if somebody was from a hostile nation, well, then they can go after them as well. And then, this is the one about the First Amendment. This was the Sedition Act of 1798. And this one seems to directly contradict the First Amendment. It criminalized the making of false statements if they were critical of the government. So remember, it had to be a false statement. But of course, who's going to decide? If the government doesn't like what you're saying, you say that's not true. You've now made a false statement. That is a crime. So the First Amendment says that Congress cannot pass a law that abridges the freedom of speech or of the press. The Sedition Act of 1798 essentially did a carve-out and said, well, yes, it can. If you're talking falsely about the government, then we can throw you in jail. Now, the reaction to this was swift. This, you can see, gets people up in arms. I guess at the time, people still had a sense of freedom. Thomas Jefferson and Madison, they joined together and they created a new party, the Democratic Republican Party. And these acts so offended the American people that the voters tossed out Adams and elected Thomas Jefferson. And this, some people call the Second American Revolution. So in just 10 years, they had abandoned the constitutional principles of the First Amendment. So when Reagan says, or anyone says, that every generation has to preserve the rights that are granted in the Constitution, this is what they're talking about, because it doesn't take much. It's not like they're enshrined forever. Each generation has to protect those rights or respect those rights. And apparently in 1798, political expediency said, well, we can't have this. We're under siege here. We can't have people criticizing the government. So the Congress, which was had Federalists in it, they came out with the Sedition Act of 1798. Now, this is before the concept of judicial review, which was Marbury versus Madison, which didn't come about until, I think, it actually came about as a result of the changing over of the Jefferson presidency. I'm not going to get into that right now, but the point being is that the Congress passed it, and it was similar to a Richard Nixon statement, is that if the Congress passed it, well, then it's constitutional. There was no judicial oversight because the court had not seized that oversight yet in Marbury versus Madison. So Congress passed a law that contravened the constitutional Bill of Rights that said Congress can't do this. So Jefferson gets in, and the Congress allows the Sedition Act of 1798 just to expire, as if it was a bad dream and it didn't happen. You can no longer say, you can't prosecute people now for making false statements that are critical of the government. The Alien Friends Act also, which allowed the president to imprison and get rid of people, throw them out of the country deemed dangerous. They let that expire, but we've since had, that was the whole travel ban. There was more legislation written, I think in the 40s or 50s, that gave the president the right to do that. So it was brought back, and I'm sure at other times in the U.S. history, they've probably granted that the president that power. But I think what was happening here was that the new Congress, the Democratic Republican Congress, the party of Jefferson, was not going to continue with these rules. And of course, the Naturalization Act, they probably fiddled with too. But what's interesting is the Alien Enemy Act of 1798 remained in effect and actually remains in effect. And that was the basis for Franklin Delano Roosevelt to intern Italian Americans, German Americans, and Japanese Americans during World War II. So what happened in 1798 was a congressional and presidential assault on the freedom of the press. Clearly, Congress passed a law. It was unconstitutional on its face, and the president signed it. So if you were a person speaking out against the government, you would have been thrown in jail. If you were a journalist or if you were running a newspaper, you could be shut down. Now, you would think the country would have learned its lesson in 1802 or 1800, whenever Jefferson took office, and this wouldn't happen again. Well, it happened again. In 1864, President Lincoln issued the following executive order. I'm not making this up. You can look this up. I'll give you the links. Arrest and imprisonment of irresponsible newspaper reporters and editors. And here is the executive order. Whereas there has been wickedly and traitorously printed and published this morning a false and spurious proclamation, which publication is of a treasonous nature. I think some newspaper reporters said that they were sending another 400,000 troops into the South. Designed to give aid and comfort to the enemies of the United States and to their aiders and abettors. You are therefore hereby commanded forthwith to arrest and imprison in any fort or military prison in your command the editors, proprietors, publishers of the aforesaid newspaper and all such persons as after such public notice has been given of the falsehood of such publication, print and publish the same with intent to give aid and comfort to the enemy, and you will hold the persons so arrested in close custody until they can be brought to trial before a military commission for their offense. You will also take possession by military force of the printing establishment and hold the same until further orders, and prohibit any further publication therefrom. Now, this is a direct order taking action against a newspaper. Now, you can say in this particular order, they were going after a newspaper who printed a falsehood, almost in the sense like the Sedition Act said that they're printing a falsehood against the government, which you might imagine that the government might have legal action against them. But rather than going against the publisher, they actually went and arrested and shut down the newspaper. Now, this is an order. However, prior to this order, specifically going after this particular newspaper, Abraham Lincoln had, on many occasions, imprisoned about 10,000 people for speaking out against the war, and about 300 newspapers were shut down during this period of time. So we see during Adams' time, there was an assault by Congress and the president on the First Amendment, and we see here now President Lincoln taking it upon himself to quell free speech. And you can argue, well, he did it because we were in wartime and it was essential. Doesn't matter. It was an attack on free speech. Now let's move fast forward to today, And I think everyone who's heard what I just said can understand exactly how the Constitution works, how the First Amendment works, and what each presidential administration did to violate the right of free speech. In the first instance, there was a law passed, and then Adams signed it, and it made it a crime to make false statements against the government, clearly in contradiction of the First Amendment. Lincoln, by executive order and by other, I guess, extra legal orders, also had people imprisoned for what they were saying. I don't think he was invoking any formal wartime act, but that was his justification. But clearly, free speech and journalists were under attack. Some were deported for exercising their speech. It may have been dangerous, but they were exercising speech, and the government went after it. What's happening today is not even analogous. So there's two parts of this. The first part we're going to talk about is the comments by the president about the media and the media's reaction to it. The second part we're going to talk about are the social media companies as they impact or the First Amendment. So let's start with the newspapers or the media companies, CBS, NBC, ABC, New York Times, Washington Post, whatever they are. Donald Trump, early in his administration, started calling them fake news. And he started calling fake news the enemy of the people. And he has stayed on that theme for the longest time. And the media has stayed on the theme that whatever he says, they're going to be against it. They've taken to the point now, last week, where 300 newspapers decided, or it's actually 350 editorial boards, got together and decided we've had enough and we need to stand up for a free press. Okay. And they all issued editorials all saying about the same thing, that we need to have a free press, we can't have this, we're under assault. Well, they're not. The First Amendment says that Congress cannot pass a law abridging their free speech, abridging the free speech of individuals, or the freedom of the press. Congress has taken no such action. The president has directed the Congress to do no such thing. There's no legislation pending, and the president hasn't indicated that he would sign anything. In fact, today, he issued a tweet. I don't have it in front of me. He said something to the effect that we need to stop the censorship by the social media companies of the conservatives, because if you're interested in fake news, he put aside, he says you can go after these other companies, but I don't want that done. He says I read them, I take them with a grain of salt, or I just ignore them. And that makes sense. If you don't like fake news, if you don't like CNN, Alex Jones, or whatever it is, you don't have to read it. There's no one who can force you to read anything. All right. So what the newspapers are saying is that somehow the free press is under attack. No, it's not. In fact, the free press is being strengthened because they're still publishing. They're not under any threat of being shut down. And the president confirmed that today, that he doesn't want them shut down. He doesn't want them censored. He doesn't want anybody censored. But the president, he has free speech. He can say whatever he wants about newspapers. He is not saying he doesn't like the press. He said, and it's very clear, he doesn't like the fake news media. He is free to express that opinion about the media. And for the media to say that that means he wants to shut us down, no, it means he doesn't think that the way they present the news is to his liking. That is an opinion clearly protected by the First Amendment. The president doesn't lose his First Amendment rights just because he's the president, and he's supposed to show some type of deference to a press that trashes him every day. You see, that's what they want. They want the president to show them deference because what they want to do is run him out of town. And now they're frightened because he stands up to them. And so they're trying to say, well, he's going to cause us to get hurt. It's a very lame argument because anytime someone disagrees with somebody, you can say you're riling up people. And so far, that hasn't happened. All right, so that is what the president has done. And the media's reaction is they keep saying that he's trying to shut them down, that he's attacking the press. No, he's attacking an element of the press that he happens to disagree with, which is his First Amendment right to do so. And they are continuing to have their First Amendment right if they want to interpret his comments as being against the free press. Well, they were free to say it, and they said it. And whatever impact it had, it had. They went out and they did 350 editorials yesterday or 2 days ago. I read some, and they all said the same thing, that we need a free press. Who's arguing that we don't need a free press? It's only the president's opinion that this is fake news. Didn't say he wants to get rid of them. And clearly Congress hasn't done anything on this. And here's just the Boston Globe. This dirty war on free press must end. It calls for urgent action by those committed to free speech and the free press to stand against the White House. I don't know what you're going to do. How are you going to stand against them? And its allies who are bent on eroding a pillar of an informed democracy. Now, let's move on from the press and their kind of misinterpretation of all of this. Let's look at how people other than the press are complaining. John Brennan was the former CIA director. Well, no, he is the former CIA director. He was the CIA director. Now, John Brennan had a security clearance, which, from my understanding, security clearances are granted and to former employees for a period of time, I think for life. And they get to keep that security clearance. And I believe the rationale is that these people that continue to have security clearances, even though they're not in the government anymore, may be of use. They could be an asset. If there's an issue, maybe Brennan has worked on some cases before, he's got some institutional knowledge. Makes sense to keep these people around. And if they can keep up to date with their security clearance, they could be helpful because they can be following cases. Makes sense, somewhat. I would think usually in companies, when you get rid of an employee, you've made arrangements so that that employee is no longer essential and that you manage to transition that employee's work to somebody else. You make sure that there's institutional knowledge so that when the guy walks out the door, the woman walks out the door, the whole knowledge of what's going on walks out with them. So it shouldn't be that way in the government, but apparently it is. So they keep their security clearances. The difference, however, is the president can withdraw the security clearance, and he withdrew it from Brennan. Now, irrespective of whether it was because of a legitimate reason, which there's clearly legitimate reasons, I think, to revoke anybody's security clearance, meaning even if the guy is cooperative and he's friendly, it's just I would reduce the security clearances to as many people as possible, just because the more people that have security clearances, the more people that know stuff that don't necessarily need to know it, and now you have issues. But in Brennan's case, Brennan not only has been outwardly hostile to the point of calling Trump treasonous, but he's also a potential material either witness or actor in the Trump collusion case. And he's also on TV, on I think it's MSNBC, constantly inferring that Trump has done something wrong, not just with the meeting with Putin, with the Russians, but that he seems to infer that he's got some information that Trump's up to no good. And then, of course, he trashes him on a personal level. Now, in order to keep your security clearance, not under my ideal world where they don't have them, but according to the guidelines, you have to conduct yourself in a way that would be consistent of being still an employee of the CIA or the FBI or whatever agency you were at. Now, clearly, if Brennan was the CIA director and he was saying that he thought his president, the guy he worked for, was treasonous, he wouldn't be the CIA director, and he would be removed, and he would have his security clearance revoked. It makes total sense. You wouldn't think that Brennan is somebody who's helpful. In fact, at one point he said that if this continues, he wouldn't be surprised, i.e. encouraging, the intelligence community to withhold information from him. Now that, in a sense, is running interference, and in a sense could be considered treasonous too, if you're going to throw the word around lightly. But how does this apply to the First Amendment? Now this is where it gets really ridiculous. So you can make the argument, which I just did, that he shouldn't have the clearance in the first place, and that especially he shouldn't have it. But he is now arguing that his First Amendment rights are being violated. Now, first of all, the Congress isn't saying that John Brennan shouldn't have a right to speak. The revocation of the security clearance and his right to speak are not connected in any way, shape, or form. They're not. He can speak all he wants. His having a security clearance is no benefit to him. The only reason he has it is to benefit the country. And if the country decides it's of no benefit to give it to him, he doesn't have it. If he's claiming he's lost some type of benefit or privilege, that means he wants it to monetize, or he wants it for some other reason other than to serve the country. There's no such thing as I have a right to serve my country when my country doesn't want me to serve it. So the idea that he's saying his First Amendment right has been violated is, to me, ludicrous. I think you don't even get to the First Amendment. You just get to the point is there's no need for you to have it, Charlie, so you don't have it anymore. All right, now here's where we move on to social media. The First Amendment is very, very tricky here because we saw in our first two cases, very, very clear-cut cases of the president and the president and the Congress in the Adams case, and then Lincoln on his own, clearly violating the First Amendment. Well, today, when they wrote the Constitution, they were talking about freedom of people to speak and the press to speak. And they were saying Congress couldn't write a law to stop that. But here's the interesting point. The press right now is free to say whatever it wants, despite their protestations that they're being shut down. We have this interposition of social media that didn't exist before. I guess the closest thing that you could have had back then were the publishers, meaning the guy who would make the pamphlets. So anybody, as far as I can tell, at the time, and I never heard otherwise, if you were somebody like Thomas Paine or whoever you were, and you wanted to get your word out, you could go to the street corner and you can yell and scream, John Adams is this or that, and then you get arrested. But in theory, you could do that back then. Or you can go and have a pamphlet made at a publisher. And I don't know of any cases where a pamphleteer said, we're not going to print your stuff because we don't like you. Now, they may have declined to print stuff because they were afraid they were going to be in trouble for printing seditious materials. But what you have today, and it's not really a very good analogy because the pamphleteers were not, you have a totally different situation today. Today, the social media giants can cover the entire United States and reach everybody, whereas you can probably find a way to print a pamphlet and reach the 400 people in Boston or wherever you're trying to reach. So you weren't really restricted from your freedom of speech by a third party. Today we have Google, Facebook, all of these companies that now control 90-95% of the audience. They have conspired, so to speak, to prevent Alex Jones from speaking. Now, Alex Jones can either be considered an individual as a freedom of speech, or he could be considered a part of the free press. Now, the 350 journalists, the 350 newspapers that wrote editorials about Trump trying to shut them down, many of those are ones that had tried, and successfully, to shut another journalist down, this Alex Jones guy. So they don't really believe in the freedom of the press. They believe in the freedom of their press not to be harassed by President Trump. But they didn't say, and by the way, these social media companies also shouldn't be censoring us, the journalists. They didn't say that. So their concern and their beef is clearly with the president, and there is no First Amendment issue there. He didn't say they couldn't exist. He clearly said he just thinks that they're fake, and he doesn't like how they write, and he doesn't like how they cover news. But the issue with the social media companies are, as everyone's heard before, the argument that they are private companies and they can do what they want. Now, a strict reading of the Constitution says Congress can't shut you down. And who's shutting you down? Well, it's a private company. So the dynamic has changed is because when they wrote the Constitution, implicit in the attempt to prevent this type of censorship, they assumed that the government would be the largest, biggest, baddest entity, like the king, that would shut you down. And therefore the protection had to be against the government doing it, not against a third party. Now what we've seen in the last 15, 20 years is Google, Facebook, the rise of these companies. They have become as large and as powerful as the federal government, and in certain areas more powerful, because, for example, Google and Facebook are working with China to censor their internet, which means that they have a greater extraterritorial reach in many instances than the U.S. Congress has. Congress has no control over China, doesn't work with the Chinese government that we know of, but meanwhile you have social media giants. They can work with government. So they're extremely powerful, and the First Amendment does not apply to them. The First Amendment applies to Congress stopping people or the press. Now, the press, and this is where it gets very interesting, the press itself relies on the social media giants to dispense or disperse their message. It used to be Chicago Tribune, New York Times. They had their own little marketing, and they would try to build their circulation. And there were very, very few national newspapers. Like the New York Times and USA Today might get their circulation out. We're talking during print days in a few other cities other than New York. And towards just before the internet, even during when the internet came out, you really only had the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the USA Today that were national papers. But for the most part, news did its own marketing, and it was based on dominating the newsstand in your city. So New York Post, New York Daily News, New York Times, that's what you'd see, and you'd vie for that space, and that's basically how you got your message out. When the internet came along, all these non-content providers, remember, Facebook doesn't produce content, Google doesn't produce content, they are not the press. They're just platforms that have become the modern day town hall. And they've managed to form an alliance with the press, or certain elements of the press, not all the press, but basically with the 300 newspapers that wrote editorials against President Trump, trying to quash their, quote, free press. So what these 350 newspapers and media outlets, coupled with the large social media giants, are saying is, our democracy is important, and there's important that a message gets across, and it's these 350 newspapers and media outlets that's the message that needs to get out, not anything else, not the president. He better knock it off. And, you know, even the president is subject to being booted off Twitter. There's many making that argument that he should be booted off Twitter because he violates their terms of service almost every day, and they seem to have an exemption for public figures. That's what Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, has said. Now, probably the best thing that can happen to alternative social media platforms is for Trump to get booted off them, to have his stuff revoked, and then for him to just go on other platforms. And that's the way that people will move off of the platforms that are actually pushing narratives rather than and pushing the narratives that they want to see, which are the ones of the 350 newspapers. But as far as a First Amendment case, a lot of people are saying, well, we have to regulate these social media companies as utilities and allow free speech on them. I think if you do that, you're essentially saying that these are now our platforms, full stop. There's no change of ownership. There's no change of mentality. They've just been told that they have to do things a certain way. Now remember, if they do that, that's the current administration telling them they have to do things a certain way. Another administration will tell them to do things another way, i.e., Congress could even pass a law and say that we can't have hate speech on these platforms. So that's why I'm really against people saying that they have to, quote, do something about them. What really has to be done is to allow a marketplace solution. And a lot of people boo and hiss at that because they say, well, it's not going to happen. But the worst thing to happen is you force companies to becoming even more closely aligned with the government, where the government actually looks over their shoulder. And if the government looking over their shoulder, like it did during 2008 to 2016, was friendly to all these social media companies, they then form an alliance. And now you have nowhere to go for your free speech. You have to hope that you get a friendly government that's more favorable to your point of view. So the First Amendment does not apply to social media companies. It doesn't. As much as people want to say that they have a right. Now, you can make an argument that they're quasi-governmental entities and therefore should be regulated as such. But again, that's got nothing to do with, there's no congressional act that says that they haven't done anything. So the social media giants are not violating your free speech. They're essentially teaming up with, this is a totally different issue. You can attack this maybe on antitrust grounds. They're teaming up with the large media companies in order to amplify their point of view versus another point of view. So that's either an antitrust violation. It could be an election issue where you're not providing fair and free access to the platforms. It could also be a breach of contract in the sense that the way they built their business was to bring in content providers on the understanding that they would be able to benefit, and then they decided to throw them off, so there's a breach of contract issue. But I don't view it as a First Amendment issue because they are not. It's not Congress telling you, and it would be in a sense if you get what some people want, which is the government to tell these companies what to do, then Congress, in a sense, would pass a law that would make these companies do whatever the thing is. They must allow, can allow, have to allow certain this, certain that. But a certain Congress can say, if it's more left-leaning or just less interested in the First Amendment, can say that they must combat freedom of hate speech on the basis that it might be a violation of, I don't know, the 14th Amendment or something. But to go after this on the First Amendment, I think that the newspapers are wrong. There is no First Amendment issue when Donald Trump speaks out against them. And Brennan is wrong for saying his First Amendment is being undermined. It's not. And the social media companies are not violating your First Amendment. All right, that's it for the monologue. Let's see what we got in the way of comments. A big crowd here tonight. Tom Manley, good evening. All is one now. Hello. Trace Young, echoes of Abe Lincoln. You nailed that from the beginning. President issues executive order to jail journalists. Yes, indeed. Jail the banker, says Tom. Good point, Tom. If anyone kneels jailing, the banker should be including. Chicago Electric Bicycle. Where are these 300 newspapers to ask for stopping censoring Alex Jones? Yes, I did make that point because they're complaining about the journalists are under attack. There's no free speech. And yet, some of them were lobbying to get rid of Alex Jones, who is a journalist. You may not like his style, and therefore you think, well, that's not what journalists act like, as if they decide how journalists are. Tom Manley, if journalists get their marching orders at 4 a.m. from a single source, how is that real journalism? Absolutely. Also, when they collude, well, hold on. The collusion of the social media giants, remember, they're not journalists, but they're working with those media outlets. Trace Young, so without Googling this title, I'm guessing that Trump's executive order was not focused on jailing journalists per se, so much as it was on jailing particular people that happen to be journalists. Nope. Trump issued no such... I never said President Trump. I said President issues executive order. That is President Johnson. But I'm going to get Donald Trump's statements today on the First Amendment, things that he tweeted out today, and they're clearly not violations, not interested in violating the First Amendment. Doc of the Bay, thank you. Joni Titterman, wait till they waterboard the hacks for sedition and treason, pretending to be journalists. Trace Young, fake journalism should be a felony. Well, that's basically what the Sedition Act said of 1798. It said if you made a false statement against the government, then that would be a felony. Well, I don't use the word felony, but it could be criminally charged. Not surprised. All right. All is one now. Anita, I'm sorry if I offended you last night with the horse meat talk. I was trying to be funny. Apology accepted. All right. Last night, for those of you who weren't here, I think the title of the episode was Horses or Transportation, period. And it was meant to be an analogy how horses had been transportation for 5,000 years, and that at some point, however, they ceased to be transportation. And I was making the analogy that potentially that could happen, or probably has happened already, to gold, and that horses are still valuable. They can be used as transportation, but they're generally not. And that gold is generally not used as currency, which is one of the requirements in most people's definition of money. All right. I just explained, Zom, I can't imagine how that conversation started or ended. All right. All right. Anita, I love my president. I never thought I would have a president in my lifetime. Love his comments and sense of humor. Rocket Man was a hoot. De La Ville, I canceled my subscription to the paper here. Told them I'm tired of the liberal bias. You see, I think too many people, including the content providers, they're all so nervous to abandon the platforms that they're on. It can be done, and it's actually easier done. The smaller ones, like if I leave, no one cares, because there's, I mean, we've 30 people here, 3,000 people that have managed to subscribe. I would say, not conservatively speaking, and by the way, I lose subscribers all the time, and I don't think it's because Google takes them from me, YouTube takes it from me. I think people get offended. They come on, they say, oh, this is a silver channel, this is a gold channel. I'm going to hear some pumping stories and make me feel better about holding gold and silver. And then they get furious listening to me because I'm not telling them necessarily that anything's going up, and I don't make predictions, so they think, well, what's the point? Listen to this guy. But I think that if the larger content providers or the president just went somewhere else, remember, they only have the content. And if the only reason people are going to these platforms is to see the content that millions and millions of people want to see, and they just left and they went to another place, yeah, it would hurt for a couple of weeks, but eventually people would figure out that the top content providers aren't there anymore. And it's pretty easy to do, but it just seems that it's going to take more people getting booted off. I'd rather they boot people off so that people move than some kind of government action forcing them to do anything. Get rid of my TV in 2001. Oh, that's a good one. I need a good for you. We need to ignore these people telling us how we should think. Well, that's the point. This is why I don't understand why anyone wants Alex Jones booted, because if you don't want to watch him, there's clearly they don't make him trend or anything. They don't force him into your feed. And they actually make it hard to find him. Now, that's foolish. If somebody wants to find Alex Jones, you should provide that service. Go, let them go see it. But if you're not interested in it, or you've seen it and you've decided you're totally against it, it's very easy not to go to the website, not to go to a YouTube to watch him. And people do that all the time with CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. There's people who hate Fox News. There's a lot of people who hate it and then watch it anyway, and it's the same with CNN. But there's some people, if you're viscerally offended by these news outlets, you don't have to visit them. All right, let's see. All right, some Trump praise. Joni Titterman, Trump and Putin could tell each other intelligent jokes where Clinton, Bushman, and Obama need a translator and a joke clarifier. All right, let's see what else we got here. Apologize, this scrolling isn't very good right. Hey, here we go. Okay, what's the next one? Anita A. I forgot, but it might have been Reed who said gave Trump false intel. You talking about Harry Reid? I think what happened was Brennan, yes, gave it to Reed and the dossier on Trump, and then I think he gave it to Comey to go and read it to Trump so they can then leak it to the press. There's all this kind of stuff going on. De La Ville, have you ever seen John the Commie Brennan when he didn't look angry or constipated? He looks really bitter all the time. I don't know what that is, whether that's his disposition, but he's definitely doesn't have a warm and friendly look to him. I mean, Comey looks friendly. He looks like, I mean, if you don't know anything about what he's done, you look at him, he seems like a normal guy. He doesn't seem odd. Strozak looks a little pissed off, but maybe that's because, I don't know if he always looks that way. When he was under questioning, he made some really weird looking faces. But Brennan is under no attack. He just, you're right, he does seem to be, he looks angry. He looks really mad. Intelligence agency is an oxymoron. I think first they used to call it military intelligence. All right, got any more questions here? De La Ville, Google removed Gab app from Play Store. Yeah, I don't know why they do that. I mean, it's not even a competitor. I could see Twitter not allowing Gab on their platform, but Google Play Store, whatever. All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining me tonight, and we'll see you again tomorrow night at 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. And please remember to go over to Smaulgld.com to subscribe there. If you haven't subscribed to this channel, I'm sure there's many of you haven't. Please do so now. And then also, I'm on Minds now and BitChute. You can watch this video. I'll upload it on BitChute as well. I'm on Twitter and even Facebook, but I only just post stuff to Facebook. I don't never even spend any time looking at what's there. So, thank you very much, and don't forget your Smaulgld mugs. I will do another mug run on, when am I going to do a mug run? Monday, I guess. I got 3 I have to send out. So if you want your mug, you want to be in on that shipment, there is your link. Just go to the Smaulgld website and get your mug ordered. And then also, oh, I need a BitChute. Let me give you the, go to bitchute.com and then just type in Smaulgld. You could see the stuff. I like to, whatever I can, I like to watch over there. There's some different stuff over there, stuff that's been booted. So, and there's the Smaulgld store. All right, and you make sure you open an account and subscribe there as well. And also, final pitch. If you're still with me, I'm going to make a pitch for a patron. Maybe just get one tonight. I have about 12, which is, I get $55 a month. So you could tell I'm doing this because I like it. And I like you guys. Thank you. All right. Good night.